so much of this work and so much of my mission, it's like midwifery, right? And being able to pull out of individuals what they can't push out on their own, right? And I tell this story. I have 4 children, and I was there for the delivery of all 4 of my children. And my final born child, I had twin boys, Cameron and Caleb. And Caleb, in the delivery room, his twin brother came out, Cameron. And no matter how hard my wife, Desiree, pushed, Caleb would not come out. I was like, what's happening? She done already pushed out 4 babies in her lifetime. And Caleb was breech. He was turned around, babies come out head first, and they weren't ready for a C-section. And 9 minutes after his twin brother Cameron was born, Caleb's vital signs were beginning to drop. And the doctor said, I have to go in and pull him out, right? And pulled Caleb out by his feet. And so many of us leaders who have pushed out great things, but the thing that we are called to really push out that is going to make a transformational impact in the world, we will never push out alone.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Managing your mindset is one of the most important things you can do to get through the crisis that we're currently in. That's why we're co-hosting a live conversation with Sarah Sarkis on Friday, June 12th at 3 p.m. Mountain Time about how to manage your mental health in the midst of the pandemic. It's completely free. All you have to do is join our listener tribe at unmistakablecreative.com/tribe and RSVP under events. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/tribe. Shawn, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Srini, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. And I am very delighted to learn that you've actually been a longtime listener, which I didn't know, but I actually found out about your work through 2 of our former guests, Chris Wilson and TK Coleman. And we will get into all of that. But I was so intrigued by what you're up to. I thought you were doing a lot of really amazing work in the world. And I think that given the nature of your work, I think this is a very fitting question to start with. And that is, where in the world did you grow up, and what impact did where you grew up end up having on the choices that you've made throughout your life and your career and the work that you're doing today?
So I'm a native New Yorker. I've lived in every borough except for Staten Island, and spent most of my formative years in Harlem and on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Raised by a single mom, strong Jamaican woman, Deanna. And she just exposed me to a great deal, right? And so I think, traveling through all of the boroughs, I've had a lot of exploration, and my life has just been one of so many dualities, right, and dichotomies. Living in Harlem and essentially, being around just all Black people, right, and then moving down to the Upper West Side and it being mixed and more diverse, and so I think it's allowed me to navigate different worlds. And I like to say, I think I can effectively navigate both the boardroom and the block, City Hall, and the corner. And a lot of that has to do with just my upbringing and just traveling and surviving and thriving in different circles.
Yeah. You're growing up with a single mom. Obviously, I don't have any idea what that is like, but what misperceptions do you think that people have about that? What do you think the impact has been of not having had a father figure in your life? And just out of curiosity, have you ever connected with your father? Do you know anything about him? These are the things that just I'm very curious about, because it seems like such a different experience. And then the other question is, so often when children are raised by a single parent, that ends up having an incredibly detrimental effect on their life. And you seem to have transcended that in very big ways. I know, because I've read your about page. I mean, you went to Columbia. You seem to have overcome what would typically be an environment that could actually hold somebody back.
So that's really interesting. I think narrative is just a powerful thing, and perception. And I do think, and particularly in the African American community, right, there's this perception of if you are raised by a single mom, that is a life of squalor and hardship and difficulty. And so, um, quite the contrary. My mother, who is, I guess, the first entrepreneur and creative in my life, was very resilient and resourceful. And what was interesting is that early on, she found someone that took care of children, right? So we were living in the South Bronx, and she found this woman, Lillian Smith, who took care of other kids, right? And Lillian, we called her Lel, was a classic big mom, matriarch in the community. And we grew up on 119th Street and Lenox Avenue. And so during the week, I was in Harlem, and on the weekends with my mother. And, this sense of community is really important in building community. And while I did not grow up with my father, I was very close to his parents. So my grandmother and grandfather on his side, they grew up, they lived in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and they would pick me up, and I would spend weekends with them. And so I never woke up one day to say, "Good morning, Dad." My father wasn't in my life. We eventually developed a relationship, and it was more of a intersection than being intertwined, I would say. But I think it's really important for folks to understand, just because someone is raised by a single mom, that does not, in some cases, that's an asset. Right? Looking at my story from behind, backwards, I think it was an asset that I was raised by a single mom, and the resourcefulness that she had. And what's really interesting, I'm an only child, right? I do have a half brother and half sister. My father eventually he did get married and had twins. And what was really interesting, I had this duality of both being a single, only child, but growing up with Lau during the week. She took care of a bunch of other kids, right? There's this movie out there, I don't know if you've ever seen it, called Lackawanna Blues by Hill Harper. And he grew up in this boarding house, and Lau had a bunch of boarders. And she also ran numbers. And Srini, I don't know if you're familiar with the numbers system, but it was an underground economy in the African American community where, like today, there's the Lotto and the Powerball and the Mega Millions. In the African American communities across the country, there was the numbers, and she ran numbers. Lel, who was my godmother, with the father of a notorious Harlem drug lord by the name of Nicky Barnes. And so his father, Roy Barnes. And so there was a lot of activity and a lot of folks coming in and out of the house. The boarders, one boarder, lots of stories and characters. Mr. Archie, who also lived in the apartment. This is one of these old Harlem apartments. There were like 7 rooms in the apartment. He was from Barbados. He was a Bayesian. And Mr. Archie's story was, no matter what the number was that day, whatever those 3 numbers were, when Mr. Archie came home, if it was 475, you can guarantee Mr. Archie was going to say in his Bayesian dialect, 475, I was going to play that number. And so I had a very rich and robust childhood. Yes, all around me there were drugs. There was violence, but there was still a sense of growing up in the '70s and late '60s in Harlem, a sense of community. And that if I did something a block away on the corner of 119th Street and 7th Avenue, there was a sense of ownership and community. And, the adults knew who I was. Oh, that's one of Lel's kids, right? And so if I got in trouble and I was doing something I wasn't supposed to do, adults in the community felt a sense of ownership and they would reprimand you. And by the time I got a block away to where I lived, and this was long before a text or a DM or social media, word traveled, right? And so I got reprimanded outside, and when I got home, I got reprimanded. I tease and say that, I have a PhD from UCLA. And UCLA, for those that know Harlem, is the university on the corner of Lenox Avenue. And so my mother just has had powerful impact. She's taught me sacrifice. We moved together full time at fifth grade when we moved down to the Upper West Side. And, one of the things, it was a 1-bedroom apartment. And she gave me, her 12-year-old son, the bedroom, and she slept on the pull-out couch, and just saw her be resourceful and just. So I think it's really important that folks don't misunderstand that just because someone has a single parent, that is a negative or a detriment.
Yeah. So we know a lot of you have been listening to us for years, and it means the world to us. What we do here at the Unmistakable Creative wouldn't be possible without the support of our listeners. If the podcast has been valuable to you, one of the best ways you can support us is to subscribe to Unmistakable Creative Prime, which gives you access to transcripts, all of our courses, monthly coaching calls, live chats with our guests, and an incredible community of creatives. And it costs less than you spend on a cup of coffee every month. For the school teachers and people in our education system, Prime is completely free to help you with this transition to teaching online. We've packed it with a ton of value and actionable content, and we hope you'll check it out. Just go to unmistakablecreative.com/prime to learn more. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/prime.
So I think that the interesting thing is you mentioned that you were around an environment where there were drugs, there were violence. And I imagine that there are probably people who I come from, the neighborhoods that you grew up in that ended up on a very different path. And so there are two questions that come from that. You mentioned that your mother is Jamaican. Was she first generation? And if so, I wonder, what impact being an immigrant had on the way that she went about raising you? Because I think that when you grew up in an Indian family, particularly, our parents, we're probably semi-close in age based on kind of what you're telling me. And my parents came here and they had nothing. It was literally, we're starting from scratch. And they had a very clear way of sort of educating us and making us go through the world, which was, you're going to be upstanding citizens of society. If we have anything to do with it, you're going to be, more than that. And so I wonder, about the immigrant aspect of it, but also then, why do you get somebody who ends up, the way that you do, despite being in a neighborhood like that? And then why do we have somebody like Chris Wilson, who comes from a neighborhood like that?
Well, what's interesting is that there's a Chris Wilson inside of me, right? I'm just part of my Chris Wilson story is my story, not to the extreme. I was never incarcerated, but got caught up in the drug culture. And, this September, I'll have 30 years clean without a drink or a drug. But growing up where I grew up, it was almost hard to escape those challenges, right? And I was just fortunate and blessed that my story didn't turn out exactly like Chris Wilson's story. So it was not like I was unscathed, right? So, but I think the point about the immigrant family and my mother coming from Jamaica, and what was interesting is that her mother came here first, and then my mother came to the States. And my mother's very independent. She was a flower child, hippie type, very independent, but education was paramount. And she just instilled that in me. And one of my memories of growing up is that my mother always had books around the house, right? They were like to the ceiling high bookshelves, and I was just surrounded by books. And I remember, picking books off of the bookshelf and looking in my early adolescence and looking for the steamy sex scenes in the book, but this love of reading was always there. And when you think about education and decisions, a transformational moment and decision that my mother made, right? So when I moved down to the Upper West Side, I went to this middle school called IS 44, which is right across the street from the Museum of Natural History, right? And transferred from a school in Harlem that was all Black to a diverse school, and Asians and white kids. And after sixth grade in IS 44, you had to make a choice you could make a choice between major math and science or major gym. Yes, major gym. And I remember when the permission slips came home, because all of my friends and all of my homeboys were like, yeah, we're going to major gym, playing sock hockey tournaments and all of that. And I remember coming home and giving my mother the permission slip for me for 7th and 8th grade to be in major gym. And she looked at me and said, you have got to be out of your mind. There is no way you're going to major gym. And you're going to major math and science, right? And so for 2 years, I had a big resentment with my mother because all of my friends, and we talk about racial equity, the dynamic was most of the Black and Latino students were in major gym. Most of the Asian and white students were in major math science. It was just amazing how this turned out, right? And, a lot of it not by accident. And so while I was dissecting frogs and messing with a Bunsen burner, my friends, and this was like on the same floor, but different ends of the hall, right? Different qualities of teaching. And I had a resentment, I couldn't hang out with my friends. And then when it was time to graduate and go on to high school, all the students from major math and science were going to specialized high schools in New York City, like Stuyvesant and Bronx Science and Brooklyn Tech. I went to Brooklyn Tech. I thought I wanted to be an architect. And I had to actually go to summer school because I missed the exam by 1 point to get in. And all of the students from major GEM were going to the neighborhood high schools. And many of them turned out fine or have lived successful lives, but the chances and the exposure, and I saw that, God, in retrospect, there was a tracking then. But that was a decision that my mother made, right? Because if it was up to me, I would have been in major gym. And there's so many decisions like that, Srini, over my life that others have made. And I've just been blessed to have an amazing cohort of mentors and people that saw something in me before I saw something in myself. And so education was really independent. My mother was a risk taker, and she exposed me to a lot. Every summer, starting at 6 years old, I was shipped off to a summer camp, the Fresh Year Fund, and was exposed to different things. And, when I was in my junior year of high school, I was involved in this youth program called the Dome Project on the Upper West Side, which had just an amazing change in my life, the trajectory of change in my life. And my mother allowed me to, during my spring break, do a project and take a bus from New York to California to visit youth programs in California. And by bus, me and another young man went, and other parents were like, you're allowing your son to go across country on a bus? And my mother was like, yes, it's going to be great exposure. And so it was things like that, the risk taken that I think I inherited as well. There's one other thing I wanted to say about my mother is that my mother and father, who were never married, but they were both dancers. And that's how they met, right? And that's how I was conceived. And my mother was a great dancer, and she was also a great seamstress, right? And for a time, she made my clothes. I have pictures of, so when I grew up, I had a big afro like Michael Jackson, and she would make my clothes. I have pictures of me in a powder blue jumpsuit that I won't post because it would be very, I would be ridiculed. And
damn it, I was going to ask you to let us use that as your album cover for the Unmistakable Creative.
But the thing about it, what she did was, and I learned to sacrifice, as I shared earlier, how she slept on the pull-out couch in the living room and gave me the bedroom. My mother decided to not pursue her artistic talents and passions and gifts in order to raise me and to work. She wound up working 30 years for the federal government, and she sacrificed a lot for me, right? And sometimes or too often parents don't do that, right? And so I thank my mother every day for that. And I just recently had my 35th college reunion at Wesleyan University. I didn't go. I couldn't go, but they had provided me with a service award just for my, the work that I've done since graduating. And I sent that to her and say, you know what, I'm not putting this on my wall, right? This belongs to you. And there's just so many things that I've done over my career. If it were not for her and my mentors and this whole sense of community around me, never would have happened.
Wow. So many more questions. So, I think that one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at your website was you talk about this idea of, giving a voice to people who have been marginalized. And we'll actually get into what your work is about. But I want to talk about this idea of being marginalized and how you define marginalized, what it means. And what does a person who comes from a place of privilege not really understand what it means to be marginalized? Because I think that, at this point, Shawn, both of us are living lives of privilege. I mean, you're a graduate from Wesleyan and Columbia. I went to Berkeley and have a Pepperdine MBA. We'd be kidding ourselves if we lied about the fact that we are approaching this life with a level of privilege that other people don't have and may never have access to. And, part of why that definition of marginalized came up for me is because of, I think my guess is you've probably already seen it since it's in the news, the documentary or the film about the Central Park Five. You probably grew up around that time, right?
Yes, indeed. I lived like 4 blocks away. I lived in Towers on the Park and 110th and Frederick Douglass Avenue. And the young men, they lived 4 blocks away on Fifth Avenue in Schomburg Towers. And yes, I remember that in 1989 when it happened. And so Ava just did a marvelous job telling and giving life to their stories. And so when we talk about privilege and when we talk about marginalization, we have to go to the roots of this country and the founding fathers and in a sense, the schizophrenia that this country is based on, right? And on one hand, values of the land of the free and the brave and the pursuit of happiness on one hand, and but on the other hand, the country built on the legacy of slavery and white supremacy and the spreading of an ideology that one race and color is better than the other, right? And so when we talk about marginalization today in 2019, we certainly have to put it in the context of the last 400 years this nation. And I certainly believe that there are levels of privilege, right? And I certainly and that's when I have 5 questions that I ask the leaders that I'm associated with, right? And one of those questions is, what are you doing about your privilege, right? And yes, I do have a certain level of privilege, being a man, being a Black man, graduating from an institution like Wesleyan University. But if I'm pulled over by police officers, there is nothing that is flashing on my forehead that is a scorecard of that privilege, right? That privilege goes out the window, dependent on the context. And I just think that this nation and we're just like still has to reconcile its roots, right? Its roots of violence and slavery, and that continues today. And so there are so many policies and structures and systems that ensure that poor people, right, and many of whom people of color, stay poor and stay marginalized, right? And so I think that that's why I have this inner compass of doing the work that I do, leading the campaign for Black male achievement. And, one of our mission mantras is that, there's no Calvary coming to save the day in our communities, that we're the iconic leaders that we've been waiting for, the curators of the change that we're seeking to see. And what I have seen in my career, what I've seen in myself, adversity has become an asset, right? And being able to bounce back from racism and being able to do that as an individual is one thing, but being able to do it as a people is a fight that we are still engaged in. And one of the things that I think is really important when I say, we're the iconic leaders that we are waiting for, the most marginalized people in not only this nation, in the world, just have, I believe we all have genius, right? And that we all have a brilliance, and the resiliency that I have witnessed, despite the structures and the systems and the racism of particularly Black people and Black people in America, is phenomenal, and it's inspiring, right? And so one thing is, and I've done this through my career, is certainly being an advocate and a champion and lifting barriers and creating platforms of opportunity for marginalized populations. But even more so than that is providing the relationships and resources for folks to become champions of change for themselves. There's this whole notion called the power of positive deviance. And what the power of positive deviance lets us know is that the solution to the world's most intractable problems resides in the hands, the heads, and the hearts of those that are experiencing the oppression, right? And I've spent part of my career in philanthropy, and sometimes in philanthropy, we take on the persona that we are paratrooping into communities with prescriptions and solutions. And the truth of the matter is that the solutions and the prescriptions for change resides in those communities already, right? And so there's this whole notion, and Brian Stevenson talks about this a lot, right? He was on the board of directors when I was at the Open Society Foundation, this power of proximity, and that the folks that are closest to the issues and the problems are the ones with the most innovative solutions, right? But resources are really important. And we talk about marginalization, that we're talking about political marginalization and education and social, but economic mobility and access to resources and looking at America's wealth gap is really important when we have this conversation.
Yeah, so there's so many things that I want to ask you about this. You may have heard the conversation that I had with Desiree Attaway, where we were talking about the intersections of race, class, culture, and gender. And we were talking about, how each of us defines racism. And I think, one of the things I said is it reminds me of this moment when I went to the Museum of Tolerance in LA, where they have two doors. And one door says that if you don't have any biases, walk through this door. If you do, walk through this door. And the one that basically says, if you don't have any biases, walk through this door, is locked. It doesn't open, which is a really interesting metaphor. And I mentioned this to her, like what was, even growing up, my parents are far from racist, but there was almost this, like, there's like among Indian people we're kind of like, okay, the litmus test of your parents' racism is bring home a black girl or a Muslim girl, and you'll figure out how racist or how tolerant your Indian parents really are. Those are our two extremes for them. Like those are like literally, you're kind of like, I could bring anybody home, but that would be kind of a litmus test. Despite how open-minded they claim to be. And so I wonder, when you were young and also as you've gotten older, what were your first experiences with racism? How did you define it? And how has that changed with age? And don't you think it's a little insane that 200-300 years after this country is formed, we're still having this conversation?
Well, yes, I do think it's insane. But I think that just the construct of racism is, I think, based in an ideology of insanity to think that a class and color of people are superior than another a race of people, right? I think, genetically we have more in common than we have differences.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting about my upbringing was that, I was exposed to, and I talked about this dichotomy, this different, and I think my mother was really intentional about this, right? And so while going to grade school all the way to fifth grade, my classes and most of the teachers were all Black, right? But when I went to summer camp, it was mixed, and I would say that race was always an issue, right? But it was a source of pride, and growing up, and Muhammad Ali was my first hero. And seeing a Black man say that I'm fast, I'm pretty, and I can't possibly be beat, and to be bold as he was gave me a sense of pride. I was very young. I was just 6 years old, or going on 6 years old. But I remember in Harlem the riots and uprising after Martin Luther King was assassinated, right? And that memory sticks in my head. Where there was a Woolworths on 116th Street and Lenox Avenue, and being able to look out the window and seeing people run in and out of the Woolworths, right? And so I don't think that it's insane to still be having this conversation today, because I think that we live in a system that is designed to perpetuate the conversation and to perpetuate the oppression of Black and brown and poor people. And until we reconcile and disrupt that system and that ideology, we are not. We're going to still be having the same issues. Just yesterday, there was congressional hearings on reparations.
Yeah.
And someone sent and posted a snapshot of, and I don't think, I think that we have to stay open to all parties, right? But when we looked at one side of the aisle of Congress, most folks didn't even show up to listen or engage in this discussion. And
Yeah.
so power and wealth is not easily. People think that, in order for you to win, I have to lose, right? And I just think that that's just the equation and the way the system has been designed in the United States. And right. And, a couple of summers ago, right? So, the summer of 2016, even then, up until that point, I lived and clung to this sense of idealism that in my lifetime, things would change in this country. And I remember within a week, there was the murder of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, by police, caught on videotape. A week later, Philando Castile outside of Minneapolis, caught on a Facebook Live. He was murdered, right? Legally carrying firearms, right? And I had to force myself to say, you know what, Shawn? Racism is not going to end in your lifetime, right? This summer, we are celebrating in Hampton Beach 400 years since first enslaved Africans were thrown to the shores, right? So here we are 400 years in. And yes, on one hand, there has been progress, but at the end of the day, Black and brown people are still oppressed. And me coming to this realization, you know what? It's not going to end in your lifetime. On one way, it was disheartening. In another way, it was a relief and permission for me to, like, you know what, do what you can while you are here, pour into leaders, leave a legacy, and that you are part of a chain and link and a lineage of amazing ancestral lineage that do what you can while you are here, right? And so that's what I've committed my life to. And that's why I lead the campaign for Black Male Achievement. And it is really based in just the premise that there is nothing wrong with Black men and boys in this country. It's the systems and the structures, and that so much of our work is about shifting the narrative and focusing on the assets and potential and possibilities of Black men and boys and the Black community. And that being able to, and this is why I like just, being on this podcast, and so much of the work that we've done over the years has been investing in film and investing in podcasts and arts and culture, and being able to, what I like to say, become masters of our own media and tell our own stories, right? That there is another side than what is projected in mainstream media. And look, When They See Us, right, by Ava DuVernay, is a classic example of the power of media and our ability to have platforms to tell our own stories.
In our recent episode with Ramit Sethi, he talked about the difference between $30,000 questions and $3 questions. And one of those $30,000 questions was, am I automatically saving and investing? All of Us Financial, an online brokerage that's Wall Street for the rest of us, can help. You get more for your money, your trades are free, and you get money that no one else shares with you. Invest and trade with confidence. Their fully transparent business practices let you see exactly how much you can make and exactly how much they share with you. Try finding that anywhere else. Visit allofusfinancial.com. For a limited time, open a qualifying account and get up to $1,000 cash incentive. All of Us Financial. Start saving money on your trades today.
Well, you're speaking my language. There's part of the reason I do what I do. Yeah, I think that, it's fitting you brought up the Ava DuVernay and When They See Us. So, we're talking about the idea of being marginalized. So what I wonder is, for how different that situation would be, for a group of people who aren't marginalized. Like, how much of being marginalized is what put those kids in that situation to have them end up in the situation they did?
So I don't know if marginalized is the proper context and framing,
Yeah.
right? I think that when we look at race and the fact that these were 5 Black boys, and when we look at the victim, a white woman, there is a long history this nation, right? Of Black people and Black men being railroaded and falsely accused. And so marginalized marginalization has something, yes, to do with it, right? But I do think that the fact of race and that these were 5 Black boys, and would they have been treated the same way if they were 5 white boys, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would venture to say no. You may have seen just this last week in Phoenix,
Uh-huh.
Arizona, and I want to give a shout out to the bravery of folks that are able to, in the face of danger, pull out their phones and capture videotape of these injustices. But you may have seen when the police, with weapons drawn, with a report that a 4-year-old took a doll out of a dollar store, and how they assaulted and came up with guns drawn a woman with a baby in her hand and pregnant. And would that have been done if they were not Black? Maybe, but I doubt it, right? And I'm not going to say that that does not happen, but I just think that the humanity of Black people in the United States, and there's a widespread ideology that we are less deserving, that we are threats, and that we don't have rights, and we can be treated any other way, which is absolutely a lie, because we have a long history of liberation fighters, right, that say, no, you can't treat us any other way. And the when they see us chronicles that story, right? And
Mm-hmm.
yes, there are other factors of poverty and legal representation, being able to, if you have and can afford the best lawyers, right? That wealth has a impact, but at the end of the day, I think it was less about them being marginalized and
Yeah.
being 5 Black boys and a case that had to be solved.
Mm. So, I want to spend some time talking about the work that you do at the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. I had a chance to look through your website, and I guess really what I want to look at is maybe particularly look at a story of somebody who's come to you and kind of the impact, and which I'm guessing you probably have dozens, probably to the point where we should probably have one of them as a guest on the show. But I wonder, could you walk us through an example of one of these youths that comes to you and kind of, maybe somebody who was headed down a wrong path, and how you help them course correct?
Sure. And I think it's important to note that the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, we were launched at the Open Society Foundations, which is the philanthropy of George Soros, back in 2008. And we were originally supposed to be a 3-year campaign to improve the life outcomes of Black men and boys. And what's interesting to know, too often in philanthropy, we look at generational and centuries-long issues and say we're going to solve this problem in a 3 or 5-year grant-making cycle. And the mere fact that we've been around for 11 years is a testament to so many folks' spirit of entrepreneurialism, persistence, relationships. And so we started off as a grant making entity, and over the last 11 years have funded and supported and helped to launch strategies across the country. We've invested close to $250 million, right? And CBMA, our focus is really on the leaders and the organizations that are working to improve life outcomes of Black men and boys. And that's men and women. It's multi-gender, multi-race, and folks think of the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. We have over 8,000 individual members, and half of them are women, right? And so there is, I think of someone like a Willie Hamilton, who runs the United Black Men United in Omaha, Nebraska. And, we all have this sense of, and need for belonging. And Willie, 8 years ago, said to me when we were in the foundation, look, I don't want to necessarily get a grant from you. It would be great. I just want to be a part of the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. And by him coming to one of our events, we do an annual gathering at the Muhammad Ali Center called Rumble Young Man Rumble. And he represented his city. And he was connected at this convening with 150 other leaders from across the country. And he realized that, I am not fighting this fight alone. Like, I'm not building and battling alone. One of my mission mantras is that God gave us two hands for a reason, so that we can build and battle at the same time. And so much of this social justice, racial justice work, we got to do both. We got to build and we have to battle. And he returned back to Omaha and declared that, he was part of the Campaign for Black Male Achievement and with his organization, and began to get others in his city engaged. And so there was this ripple effect, right? And so while it's a national movement, the change really happens locally, right? It happens in places. And we say that, your promise of place, which is our place-based strategy, is wherever you decide to take a stand. And there are so many leaders like Willie Hamilton and the young people that they work with across the country that are exposed to this national movement, and that they are the next wave of, or the current wave of social justice leaders. One of the things that brings me joy, we have an opportunity to bring folks across the country to our convenings and our gatherings, and to see a young man like Ernest, right? Ernest Butts, who was a fellow at the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. He was never in a plane. He never flew before. And 2 years ago was his first flight going to Louisville, Kentucky for the Rumble Young Man Rumble. And it was kind of like the Roger Bannister mile, right? Once he broke that 4-minute mile and he had that exposure, he's in Puerto Rico this summer and organizing and supporting folks that are still recovering from the hurricane. And he did some traveling last year. And so much of this work, and so much of my mission, it's about it's like midwifery, right? And being able to pull out of individuals what they can't push out on their own, right? And I tell this story. I have 4 children, and I was there for the delivery of all 4 of my children. And my final born child, I had twin boys, Cameron and Caleb. And Caleb, in the delivery room, his twin brother came out, Cameron. And no matter how hard my wife, Desiree, pushed, Caleb would not come out. I was like, what's happening? She done already pushed out 4 babies in her lifetime. And Caleb was breached. He was turned around. Babies come out head first, and they weren't ready for a C-section. And 9 minutes after his twin brother Cameron was born, Caleb's vital signs were beginning to drop. And the doctor said, I have to go in and pull him out, right? And pulled Caleb out by his feet. And so many of us leaders who have pushed out great things, but the thing that we are called to really push out that is going to make a transformational impact in the world, we will never push out alone. We need to get vulnerable and be able to say, as leaders, and particularly when we're looking at Black men, to be able to go to another man and say, or woman, and say, I have something inside of me and I need your help to pull it out. And I'm grateful that I've grown up in a generation where I've seen a shift around masculinity and gender norms. My father and grandfather, to cry was a sign of weakness, right? To be vulnerable was a sign of weakness, and to be afraid and to let somebody know that you were afraid was a death sentence in some cases. And we are, with the Campaign for Black Male Achievement and so many of our partner organizations, are in a space now where this whole notion of addressing toxic masculinity and patriarchy is something that is acceptable and necessary in our community. And one of our members is a guy named Jason Wilson out of Detroit, who has a best-selling book. We just told his story. He'd be a great guest. It's called Cry Like a Man. And just really demystifying this whole notion of emotional sturdiness and not being able to share emotions. And Srini, I tell the leaders that I'm associated with, if you are not engaged with a mentor, an executive coach, and a therapist, you are at a disadvantage, right? And this whole notion of addressing and pulling the covers off of mental health in our community, I'm just seeing so much more momentum over the years around this, because to be Black in America, as James Baldwin said, and I'm paraphrasing, is almost to be in a constant state of rage, a constant state of rage. And so we need to be champions and be able to share our vulnerability as Black men, and to say, you know what, it is okay. What, you don't tell a 8-year-old boy, don't cry and act like a man. He's 8 years old. He's supposed to cry. It's okay to cry. And so what I am seeing just across the country with so many of my peers and the next generation, that it is okay to be emotionally vulnerable. And part of our work, we launched 3-4 years ago, BMA Health and Healing Strategies, when we are addressing the health, healing, and wellness of the leaders. So many of our leaders came to us and said, I am depressed, I am stressed out, I have been thinking about suicide. And we said, wow, this is the Calvary, right? These are the leaders, the hometown heroes and local leaders that we are invested in to do the work. If they are traumatized, how are we going to win? And so we have just seen so many investors over the last few years say, you know what, this issue of healing and wellness is important. There's a Dr. Shawn Dove in San Francisco that has really been crusading this notion of healing-centered communities and schools. And so, I'm encouraged. I often, when I look at the condition and the state and where we stand as Black people in this nation, I often say it's the paradox of promise and peril, because there is both a peril. It is still perilous in this nation for a Black man. But I also see so much promise. And I know that you've done a lot of work around, where you put your attention, right? And where you put your focus, right? Not that we ignore the peril, not that we ignore the liabilities, but we focus on the promise and the assets, because I firmly believe that what we focus on grows, and we have to tell that story of promise and love and how we lead. And if we don't tell that story, somebody's going to tell the story for us.
Amazing. Well, this has been really, really just a treat and eye-opening, thought-provoking. One of those conversations that I think really makes us think it, and hopefully brings about, the start of a conversation for a lot of people that I think is much needed. So I want to finish with my final question, which I know you've heard me ask as a longtime listener of the show, and that is, what do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Wow, I knew you were going to ask me that question too, right? But so. What makes you unmistakable is that a few things. That when you die, your eulogy is such of how you lived your life, what you represented, and the values, that someone hears your eulogy, and your eulogy becomes their life's epilogue. And I think that being unmistakable is that we are called to do things that if they are not done through you and by you, they won't be done at all. And that there are things that people look to and people hear and they say, that is distinctly Shawn Dove. That is Shawn Dove's a fingerprint, and that no one else could have done that except for him.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and sharing your story and your insights on all of the work that you're up to with our listeners. Where can people find out more about what you're up to? And also, are there any requests that you have for our audience that they can help with, in terms of your own efforts?
Sure. So I can be reached at, go to my website, blackmaleachievement.org. I personally can be reached at sdove at blackmaleachievement.org. That is my email address. And I am on Twitter, and I am on Instagram. And I believe that this is not, when we talk about Black male achievement, Black America's journey, right? This is America's journey, right? And so there is something that everybody can do, no matter gender or race. And I would ask folks to go to our website and become a member. And join the campaign for Black male achievement. There are ways that you can devote your time, your talent, and your treasure as an ally and a supporter and a member in the movement.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we'll wrap the show with that.
Did you know that every Sunday our community manager, Milena, sends out 10 key takeaways from episodes just like this one? All you have to do to receive it is sign up for our newsletter. Just visit unmistakablecreative.com/newsletter and you'll get them delivered right to your inbox. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/newsletter.
If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, one of the biggest things you can do to support us is to leave us a review. Go to ratethispodcast.com/unmistakable and you'll see the ability to submit a review regardless of what app or device you're currently listening on. Again, that's ratethispodcast.com/unmistakable.
This is Acast Recommends. Every week we pick one of our favorite shows, and this is one we think you're going to love.
This is Creepy, a collection of the most famous and disturbing stories and urban legends from the deepest, darkest corners of the web. Hosted by creator John Grills and a cast of creepy narrators. New stories added every Sunday. Listener discretion is advised. Listen free on your favorite podcatcher or find us at bloodydisgusting.com/podcasts.
Acast is home to the biggest podcasts from the U.S. and around the world. Subscribe to this show and hundreds more now via Acast or wherever you get your podcasts.